Okay, hey, this is Mr. James back with part two of the MLA edition of formatting your paper. Um, we're going to go just a little bit deeper in the formatting and kind of talk about how to structure a quote this time. Part one ended a little abruptly. That's because I didn't know that the Screencast-O-Matic was going to cut me off at 15 minutes because I had the free version. But I felt like it was pretty good video. It just kind of the transition's not as smooth as I'd like it to be into part two, but that's okay. We're gonna keep rolling with it. So if you would just keep watching, and we'll show you how to get those quotes formatted properly. So what we're gonna cover is when and how to cite, when and how to quote, and then how to ICE a quote. That's just a little acronym I like to use. It stands for Introduce, Cite, Explain. So that's the three stages of a quote, and yes, it's kind of formulaic, but if the formula works, then that's okay. We're working with academic writing here, so it's okay to follow a little bit of a structure, and it can still be interesting to read and make a contribution to scholarship, which is ultimately what we want to do with our writing, have a discussion with other scholars. So first, when and how to cite. You should use parenthetical citations every time you use information that came from outside of your brain. There are exceptions. For instance, we know the country was founded in 1776. We know that Shakespeare wrote Hamlet, so you don't have to cite those kinds of things. But most of the time, if you're thinking, wait, does everybody know this? Is this common knowledge across the whole United States, across the whole world? And if the answer is no, then you should cite that information. Otherwise, it's plagiarism. Even if you paraphrase, you should still cite the information, because once again, if you're taking it and you're essentially you're saying, I thought of this all on my own, unless you give a citation. That citation is what lets everybody know that you're giving credit where credit is due. So make sure you do that. And I'm going to give you a quick example in this video. So just stay tuned. You're asking yourself, well, why should I use quotes? Sounds like a bunch of trouble. And then when should I use them? So it boils down like this. Most academic papers should be an argument. They may not be persuasive per se. They may be literary analysis. They may be expository. But essentially, you're still making a claim and supporting your claim. So in order to do that, you need evidence. Nothing strengthens an argument like evidence. Ergo, quoting adds evidence. So that's your why, because it makes your paper stronger. But don't overdo it. A paper should be a synthesis of information. It shouldn't just be a collage or a patchwork of other people's quotes. Then you're just throwing other information in there, and you're not really writing a paper, you're just copy and pasting one. Even if it's not word for word, you're still just throwing the information in there. You need to think more like a writer. Writing is a craft that you need to develop. Whether or not you're going to college, whatever you're doing, writing it's like a part of you. You may not, you may be a welder, but you are also a fisherman. So you're developing that craft of fishing. Writing should be one of those things that you develop, because communication is key in all parts of life. So when you're developing that craft, one thing you should be able to do well is to weave that information in with your own information while still giving it credit, and produce something different, more of a quilt than just a patchwork of things. So when you need to add evidence, and the author has already presented the evidence in the best way, that's when you should quote. You can't say that you can't paraphrase it any better than they have already said it. That's when you go ahead and use their words. Or if you're writing about literature and you need your reader to examine specific lines to understand what you mean, that's when you should use direct quotes, direct evidence from the text. So let's talk about how to quote. So one thing in academic writing, well, even in journalistic writing, but we're looking at academic writing here, you should give the credentials of the person you're quoting. You should let your reader know why you're quoting this person. So if we're doing research and you wanted to add a comment by an English teacher because you're doing research about English, then say you were going to quote Joshua James, teacher of English. That teacher of English phrase gives me my credentials. Not only does that add credibility to me, but it adds credibility to your paper. So now people know why you're using that person's information, because they are at least somewhat an expert in this field. And even if you're taking information that's not a quote, even if you're paraphrasing, you should still add those credentials at first. Now let's look at quotes structurally. The most common way to introduce a quote, the most common structure, is the introductory clause followed by a comma followed by a quote. So for example, Henry David Thoreau argues, "The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation." And then I give my citation in parentheses, which is just the page number you see because Thoreau has already been mentioned. You don't have to put Thoreau in parentheses. Now, if I had just said the author argues, then I would have to put Thoreau 379 in the parentheses. But since he's already been mentioned in the sentence, I can just go with the page number. And then after those parentheses, you see the period. I talked about this in the first video, but just to review, the punctuation goes after the citation in MLA style. Introduce a quote is kind of the way that adds emphasis to one specific piece of text. So this is the independent clause followed by the colon followed by the quote. Henry David Thoreau summed up the tragedy of modern life in one line. The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. 379. The period again coming after the parentheses. I'm doing this because I want the emphasis on this one quote. I'm not simply discussing the quote. I'm telling you that he summed it all up in one area. So if I'm writing a paper about how modern life is taking away from our inner nature lover or our inner desire to live life to its fullest, to seize the day, which Thoreau believed. He believed that all these things that were coming at us were taking away from our desire to seize the day. If I wanted to say that and I wanted to emphasize that not only do I think that, but this expert, this transcendentalist author, Henry David Thoreau, believes this, then I might introduce the quote this way, to put the emphasis on the mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. Then we have the partial quote. This is when you want to merge your writing with the piece of writing that you're trying to quote. So for example, the author claims that most people's lives are filled with quiet desperation. Thoreau, 379. So this I might use in a spot where I'm not trying to, I'm not trying to give the reader an aha moment. I'm just trying to add some evidence to further my claim. Like I might have already claimed that Thoreau believes that modern life is too busy, and that most people don't live life to its fullest, and then I'm going to throw in this extra line. He also thinks that our lives are filled with quiet desperation. And you see the citation is still the same. There's no comma here because I'm merging the two sentences. It's just a regular sentence that I'm writing, but I'm taking his words, so I'm going to give him credit for those words. And the only words I took were quiet desperation. Then we're going to look at an example in here, not just of the partial quote, but it's also kind of going to look at a little more of how you put and synthesize different pieces of information in. First, let's look at the formula. Introduce, cite, explain. If you do this, you are making your quote function. You're giving it a purpose. Some young writers often will just put a quote in there and they think the quote speaks for itself. Well, it does in a way. It does for that author, but for what you are trying to say about it, it doesn't tell me what I need to know as a reader. It only tells me what that author thought. So you can't assume that what is in your mind is going through someone else's mind when they read it. That's why literature is so great. That's why it's so full of just adventure, and that's why it promotes thinking and critical thinking and conversation, because we can all read it in a different way. So make sure you explain your interpretation so that your reader can look at that spot and see if they can interpret the same thing or if they interpret something different, and then we have a scholarly discussion, and that's what a paper should be. So let's look at an example of how ICE kind of works in a paper. Just an example. It's not exactly an academic essay, just something I threw together because I'm a Giants fan, and Madison Bumgarner's performance in that 2014 World Series was just legendary. So I just put something together from a source that a Sports Illustrated source, which is a trusted source. So we're just going to take a look at how this functions in this paragraph. So let's just assume that top sentence there is the thesis statement. There's no introduction above it because I'm just making this up as I go, but in a normal essay there would be an introduction above it. So then we have our thesis statement, which is Madison Bumgarner stands as one of the most dominant pitchers in the last 50 years. So everything in my paper is going to pertain to that argument. Tom Verducci, legendary sports reporter, had the pleasure of announcing to baseball fans that Bumgarner was Sports Illustrated Sportsman of the Year in 2014. Verducci argues that Bumgarner's 2014 season, in which he pitched 270 innings and finished with a 1.03 ERA, means that he will forever be linked with 2014, the way Christy Mathewson is with 1905, Carl Hubble with 1933, and as Sandy Koufax, Oral Hershiser, and Randy Johnson and Kurt Schilling are with the years they were named SI Sportsmen. SI.com. A sports writer of Verducci's caliber associating Bumgarner with pitching greats from throughout baseball history elevates Bumgarner's status among the greatest pitchers of all time. Okay, so let's check out the highlighted sections here. Tom Verducci, legendary sports reporter. That's where I'm adding Verducci's credentials. As I mentioned earlier, the first time you speak about an author, or the first time you give an author's information from an author, then you should mention his credentials. And a legendary sports reporter lets us know that what Verducci has to say is important and adds to this argument. Then we look at Verducci argues. That's my introducing the quote. And you can see the type of quote introduction I used here is the partial quote, like I showed you in the most recent slides. Verducci argues that Bumgarner's 2014 season, in which he pitched 270 innings and finished with a 1.03 ERA, means that he will, and I'm not going to read the quote there, but that's the quoted section. So you see where the quotation marks are. Then we have a space. Then our citation is highlighted here in green, SI.com. That's just a shortened version. Now, you could do VerducciSI.com, but since Verducci's already been mentioned in this sentence, it's okay to just go with the SI.com. On your works cited page, you'll have the full website, the full web address to go to SportsIllustrated.com, but just within your paper, you're just going to do a shortened version of that website. And then we have the explain part. A sports writer of Verducci's caliber associating Bumgarner with pitching greats from throughout baseball history elevates Bumgarner's status among the greatest pitchers of all time. Not the best sentence in the world, but it certainly serves its purpose to explain the quote. So it was introduced by giving you Tom Verducci and who he was. It let us know what he did. He argued this thing. He argued or asserted or claimed, whatever verb you want to use, that as long as it's appropriate, that he will forever be linked with 2014 the way those other great pitchers are linked with their years. And then I explained what that means. Well, because Verducci's so important, him associating Bumgarner with those other great pitchers lets us know that this expert shares this opinion with me. So while that may not fully prove it, it certainly supports the idea that Bumgarner is one of the greatest pitchers of the last 50 years. So to review, you should quote only when necessary. Most of the writing should be yours. And then even when using evidence, you should paraphrase unless the writer said it the best way it could be said originally. You want to cite everything that doesn't come from your brain. Quotes, paraphrases, and summaries. It came from somewhere, so we got to give somebody credit for that. You got to introduce your quote. You can't just throw it out there at the reader and expect it to explain itself. You got to cite your quote because, again, we're not plagiarizing. We need to make sure everything comes from a source. And then explain your quote. Don't leave it just floating there. Let us know what happened. And if you do those things, you should be able to effectively use quotes to support the thesis or the main theme in your essay, whether it's analytical, argumentative, or expository. This should work for using evidence properly. So thanks for listening. In the next video, I'll show you how to set up your works cited page, and then you'll be good to go for research papers for the rest of the year.